Okay, so let's get on with the second part of our interview with Tony Wright, author of Left in the Dark, which you can get online through the usual channels. There's a Kindle version, and you don't need a Kindle for that. You can just download the app if you want to read it on your computer. And the book is about how the human brain has been shrinking for something like the past 200,000 years. Last week, we spoke about the symptoms of this and why it might have come about, as I've just explained. And this week, we want to look a bit more at what we can do to counteract some of the damage and get a glimpse of some of that latent function still within the brain that nowadays takes a bit of work to access. So, Tony, thank you so much for joining us again by Skype. Having read your book, Left in the Dark, I do have great faith that we can tackle this issue of getting more brain function back, given that your writing, which is about complex neurochemistry, is actually really easy to understand. So the hope is that because you've made it accessible, more people will come to know the theory, more research will be done, and hopefully we can start looking at what we're going to do about it. And I think you've said that because you feel the most important thing is to illustrate to people who are neurologically deficient, because that's all of us, that there is a problem with the brain they're using to understand what you're trying to tell them. What you've done is you've outlined a sane theory, a sane response to the data, and then put it into the language of insanity.
Well, I hope so, and that's the basic idea. We're running on this. We're running on the left side of the brain. It's pretty stupid. It's the side that's more damaged, and yet that's the side we initially need to use to see the diagnosis. That's the side that has to be convinced there's a problem. So it's pointless trying to convince our right hemisphere because it doesn't have its hands on the controls. You know, it's like the airline pilot's demented. I've got to convince the pilot that he's demented in such a way, let go of the controls. Well, it's got to be in that language. So back to what can be done. I think this can be very formulaic. And if you look at the ancient traditions, again, you know, they were talking about what I think can be interpreted as diagnosing the onset and progression of a neurological condition. They also have embedded in them these practices and techniques, and there are often a lot of dogma around them, a lot of, we don't even want to talk about this kind of stuff. Well, if you strip all that away, you end up, I think, with three basic approaches, and I think it correlates well with the modern neurology. The first one is, imagine you've inherited, a clapped out old Italian sports car. You want to know its original design. If you're going to rebuild it, the first thing, you don't try and take it out on the track and drive it really fast. You want to know how it was built, what it was built from. So it's basic engineering stuff. You'd rebuild it. Okay, so that's back to diet. Diet's an absurd word. We need to get away from diet. We need to be thinking about advanced molecular engineering or re-engineering. Our system, our body and our neural system is built molecules at a time in an incredibly complex way. This massive orchestration going on all simultaneously beyond our current comprehension. And yet there it is. And it's built at this molecular level. So diet isn't about eating food. It's about highly advanced molecular engineering. So we start there. We look at what was it built from? What was the original specifications? And that, of course, includes design. And I don't mean necessarily intelligent design. I'm talking about how the DNA is read. Well, of course, most of what we eat doesn't have a huge impact on how the DNA is read. But if what we originally ate was this DNA reading design kit, we currently call it fruit. Well, it's, the reproductive organs. We got to look at that. We then got to look at construction materials. Does it matter what you build your PC from? Does it matter what you build your car from? Does it matter what you build a 747 from? Basic engineering. If you say to any engineer, it doesn't matter what you build it from, it'll work the same, they'd laugh at you. And yet when it comes to the human brain, somehow we have these extra special rules. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's fine if you build it from junk food, if you eat this, it doesn't make any difference. Well, that's obviously complete insanity and rubbish. So looking at high specification building materials, and then tied in with that, of course, is the fuel. What is it fueled with? Well, we currently know quite a lot about what our own genome produces, the serotonins, the dopamines, etc., etc. However, back to this idea, if our neocortex in particular was the product of a symbiotic association, then we have to look at the incredibly complex neuroactive compounds that are in the plants, the plant's genome, and they were pumped into the fruits. And we already know quite a lot. The pharmacologists can tell us a lot. Thousands of chemicals that were essential and necessary part of this operating environment. So we can start putting some of that back, okay? That's what we can do right now. We can start rebuilding our neural system, our perceptual equipment, not from the worst possible stuff we could ever have invented and laughingly call it junk and wonder why we're in a mess, because that's a symptom of mental ill health. We start looking at the most pristine, high spec stuff we can get, because this is the most advanced thing we currently know. The thing between our ears, each and every one of us has something that makes our current technology laughably stupid, and yet we treat it like a piece of garbage. So we start rebuilding it sensibly, and then tying back into the idea that one side of our brain, the left side of our brain, that currently thinks it's advanced, is actually we've got it back to front as it would. It's pretty seriously limited, pretty seriously damaged. Now, until we can come up with a fix for that, and that may be possible, but before we get there, the sensible thing to do is limit its influence. If it's badly damaged, if it's demented, if you've got the pilot that's badly demented and the co-pilot that's not in such bad shape, which one do you want flying the plane? It's that simple. Well, okay, so these ancient approaches, I think this is what they were doing. They talked about natural diet. There's a lot of talk about, these kind of dietary approaches. Remember, advanced molecular engineering, covered that. Then we go to, well, can we inhibit the negative influences of this sense of self that's emerging, that's causing us all these problems? Well, if you look at all these approaches, they break down into these camps. Re-engineering, that's diet, then techniques, practices, or what I'd call neurological treatments to inhibit the influence of the left. That's what our ancestors came up with. So things like, for example, the left hemisphere's designated speech as a highly advanced and unique trait of the left hemisphere, as it would. It's circular self-assessment. Yet we know speech is effectively a dumbed-down version of singing. Singing is way more complex and carries so much more information. And most of us, and certainly I include myself, would either struggle to sing or be too frightened to sing, which is kind of weird. But there it is. So the speech center, the speech is like the relic version of a much more advanced communication system. And we can tell we're in our left brain because we speak. Unless we're singing to each other in some kind of operatic approach, we're in our left hemisphere. It applies to everybody. But you can do things to reduce the left hemisphere influence. So, for example, the Trappist tradition where they wouldn't speak, not for hours, but for days, weeks, months on end. And the left hemisphere has so little function anymore, so little sense of self, that unless it's thinking in concepts or speaking, it kind of almost auto switches off. So most of us, it's running like a crazy hamster on a wheel, chundering on all the time in verbiage and coming up with ideas. Because if it doesn't do that, its sense of self disappears, and that scares the hell out of it. But if you can stop, if you can slow down, and if you can meditate, and if you can allow that chattering voice to begin to diminish, it's like turning the volume down, turning the dimmer switch down. And as you do that, slowly but surely, from the background, something else begins to emerge, okay? So it's things to dampen the left hemisphere down. Other things that can dampen it down, well, tied in with this, you can kind of bore it to death. Again, if it's not hyperactive, it feels like it doesn't exist. So getting away from too much stimulation. That's why people used to go on retreats, again, prolonged meditation, anything that didn't stimulate that whole conceptual side of the brain, thinking in words. Another approach, more controversial approach, but very ancient approach. It's in some of the earliest written records. It's in the North American or in various vision quest traditions. It's even part of the Buddhist tradition of very prolonged meditation, is to stay awake for a long time. Not something I recommend without a lot of research, but it's a very ancient tradition. And it comes down to this. If our left hemisphere is badly damaged and its batteries are pretty weak, okay, it gets tired quite quickly. What happens when we get tired? We get clumsy, we get irritable, our speech begins to slur. But interestingly, we become more emotional, yeah? Because there's a leakage, we're starting to get something leaking through, and that often frightens us. A lot of people don't like to lose control of their emotions. They don't even want to feel anything, okay? Well, if you stay awake for a long time, what you can do is tire the left hemisphere out so much. Not only does it become even more dysfunctional, sure, that's a window to get through, but its ability to stay in control begins to weaken. And the right hemisphere, for all that it's locked away in the basement, it's essentially still got better design and it's got stronger batteries. So it can stay awake longer. So you can imagine if you stay awake, you're weakening your dominant sense of self. And yeah, it's quite frightening and it doesn't like it. And you don't want to do it. But if you get through that, eventually you get to a window where it starts to fade into the background. and something else starts to emerge. And this is written about in so many ways, so many formats. It doesn't make sense anymore in the modern tradition of sleep research. Oh, we need a sleep. If we don't get 8 hours sleep or 6 hours sleep, we're gonna become dysfunctional. And it's right. Your left hemisphere will become even more dysfunctional. But its ability to stay in control also starts to slide. And you can manage that and you can work with that. Obviously, you need to know what you're doing. All I'm saying is, I'm not saying this is something for anybody to try at home without a lot of research. The point is these traditions exist. They've come down to as they exist. They're telling us something about the nature of the underlying condition as well. So again, techniques, approaches, or as I'd call them, treatments to begin inhibiting the left hemisphere. And in parallel with that, techniques, practices, or treatments to engage the latent right hemisphere, because normally it's so suppressed, so locked away, and missing the essential neurochemistry that we no longer provide it. Remember, our own genome cannot possibly provide the neurochemistry, the right hemisphere, or to be fair, both hemispheres needed when they were fully functioning. Because remember, I'm just saying the left's a damaged version of the right. They were both phenomenal pieces of equipment working in union at one point. So what can we do to stimulate the right hemisphere? Well, obviously, we've already covered basic rebuild. That's going to potentiate it. How can we get it out of the prison? Well, because its neural architecture is radically different, it still retains this very unique architecture that's radically different. It has a whole different requirement. It needs a complex range of biochemistry it no longer gets. However, traditional approaches have come up with neurochemical analogs, not necessarily the neurochemistry that we once run on, but copycat chemistry that's incredibly powerful. It seems to differentially stimulate the right. The left hemisphere doesn't respond to it anymore, but the right will. So we're talking about the traditional plant medicines or their modern synthetic equivalents. So we're talking things like DMT, we're talking things like LSD, marijuana to some degree, MDMA to some degree. They will selectively stimulate the right hemisphere at the expense of the left. Okay?
Well, that's interesting because we're talking about a range of chemicals that society has completely outlawed. So people listening in our neck of the woods can't take any of these substances legally. And of course, if you do take them, they can be very disorienting, life-changing drugs, because they remove that sense that we live in the materialistic world that we've been taught we do at school.
Well, yeah, of course, and that's the whole point, and that's exactly what they should do. But the experiential reality, and remember, we have effectively two neural systems producing what are now different selves. At one time, they produced this. If you think of the hemispheres as like a pair of Stradivarius violins, okay. They were built to the same specification and they played the same notes and they sung beautifully together. Okay, well, one of them has been dropped, it's been stood on, it's been out in the rain, it's trashed, okay? And you try and play it now and it makes an awful, awful sound, unfortunately. And it's not apportioning blame, but that's our normal sense of self. If the instrument is our brain, if the instrument is the neural cells and neural architecture, the music is our sense of self, okay? Now, all we've heard ourselves play is predominantly the left hemisphere. That's all we're familiar with for the most part, most of us, okay? Well, if you switch to the violin that can still play pretty well, maybe not perfectly anymore, but pretty well, what should and sounds like conceptually a wonderful idea, experientially, that's a very frightening experience because by definition, the self that we're all familiar with, the self I'm using to speak to you, is the very self that's going to get shoved out the way, and that's a scary experience. And people report this all the time, and it's a typical reaction to taking mind-altering substances that stimulate the right hemisphere. Of course, people have these things happen spontaneously. They have them happen through meditation. All sorts of approaches can work, but the psychedelics, they're like the equivalent of using jump leads on your car. It's like a sudden kick it up the arse and it springs into life. And the first few times, yeah, it can be frightening and very confusing. But of course, there are living traditions. They were universal at one time. They've been slowly snuffed out as the left hemisphere has taken control because there's such a threat to its existence. But they teach you how to use these things, how to work with them, and slowly begin to incorporate that sense of self into your experience without it being such a fear, without it being such a threat. And it takes a while. It takes some training. It takes I guess like the first time you go down some kind of huge roller coaster, and if you're scared of heights, you're not going to do it. The last thing but you finally persuade yourself to do it. And somehow, unless you're incredibly terrified, the excitement and the rush is enough to get you back up the stairs again. Even though it's still scary, it's like, no, I want to do that again. And eventually it just becomes something you can do with ease. And that's embedded in these traditional approaches. Of course, you put this biochemistry in the hands of an ignorant culture, and sometimes you're going to have people running into trouble. That's not necessarily because the biochemistry is problematic. It's because we've created a culture of stupidity and ignorance when we come to using these things. But certainly they have a potential role to play. I don't necessarily think they're the whole answer, as some people do. And of course, unless you've done the preparation, unless you've rebuilt your neural system as well as you can, then it's a bit like putting rocket fuel in, as I said earlier, a clapped out old car. There's a risk you're going to do some harm. Why not rebuild it first? Why not get it to the best specification you can before you try and launch the damn thing? Is that not common sense?
And it takes a while, doesn't it? Because like you, I've been living on a natural diet for a long time with varying degrees of consistency. I think I've eaten a largely raw vegan diet for about 9 years. And in my experience, after the detox period, which feels like you're getting the flu for about a week, the physical changes are pretty fast. Chronic conditions will take longer to resolve, possibly a year or two. I know nobody wants to hear that, but that's the healing time. And then mentally, over time, again, possibly a year or two, things like dreams will settle down into narratives that communicate quite clear messages to your conscious mind. Like, my dreams make sense, which obviously they didn't before, because no one's normally do. Mental health issues seem to go, and the depression has really been eradicated. I mean, it's as though this diet bolsters your emotional poise an awful lot. What's your experience of diet alone? Because you've been on this natural diet for quite a long time, haven't you?
Well, I'd say an approximation. I don't think it's as good as it could be, but it's the best I've been able to manage in the culture I live in and so on. But yes, of course it makes a very significant difference. And all the things you've just described, yes, I'd certainly support that. And many other people say the same things by degrees. I mean, there's quite a lot of variation in how easily people can begin to make those changes and what effects there will be, because the part of the paradox of this, part of the challenge with this is where we're not only are we perceptually dominated by our left hemisphere, it's the effective management system for our assimilation, for our endocrine system, for everything. It's got a very big influence on all the very interfaces, for example, with diet. So if our neuro assimilation system isn't working very well, and bearing in mind it can no longer be a specialized fruit-eating assimilation system, because it just can't be if we've been separated for that long. It's reverted to something else. So we're kind of trying to reboot it with the very biochemistry that's essential for it to work, and yet at the same time it doesn't have the specialist capacity to deal with. So there's a bit of a paradox there. Of course, you can do these things in steps. That's what most people recommend. You make a very slow transition, and as you improve your biochemistry, your neurochemistry, you begin to potentiate the right hemisphere. It's not going to be a complete solution, but you begin to potentiate it, and it begins to work a bit better. And of course, that makes the assimilation process easy. A bootstrapping effect. Improve it a bit, it can work a bit better, and then you can improve it a bit more, and so on. And yes, a lot of people report exactly that. Improvements across the board, as long as you take it at a pace you can cope with. And of course, as I've already alluded to, it's much more efficient if you combine improving your diet with at least some basic techniques to begin shifting cerebral dominance a bit. So some yoga, some meditation, and so on. Then you get a double whammy. You get the two things working together, and it improves the very approaches that you're trying to bring with diet. They become more effective, and so on. And yeah, you mentioned dreaming, for example. Dreaming, certainly anything other than mundane dreaming is almost the closest the right hemisphere gets to full consciousness. Those more deep and complex dreams, that's the right hemisphere kind of trapped in the basement. Well, when the left hemisphere is asleep, it's not suppressed so much. That's as close to reality as the right hemisphere usually gets. Well, you start fueling it better, and of course it starts to make sense. You can get into lucid dreaming. You can start actually making sense of the world when you're asleep with practice.
Yeah, that's my experience, that dreams are no longer about anxiety, which they
Yeah,
always were before, but now they
yeah.
really do seem to be the subconscious making sense of the waking world. And sometimes I wake up with tremendous insights into science,
Yeah.
into the wider nature of things. And it does feel profound, and you can
Yeah.
come across as evangelical about it because the desire is suddenly there to let everyone know about this now.
Absolutely, it is profound. That's what's driven me for so long. The glimpses I've had, which are probably quite minor, but still shattering what I kind of thought I knew before that. And yeah, diet absolutely. This advanced re-engineering is a first step. However, it can only go so far. It's not enough for the vast majority of people, probably for everyone. It's not enough to overcome cerebral dominance. All it can do is start potentiating the the neural architecture that remains in the right hemisphere that can facilitate these more advanced traits, this different sense of self, this profound sense of connection and empathy, and a higher cognitive function, much greater cognitive function, much more ability to figure things out. That's all locked away. Well, you start putting some of this stuff back, and it potentiates it. However, unless you can take the jailer out of the equation, and I'm talking about the left hemisphere now, that's as far as it will go on its own. And I don't want to sound pessimistic here, because I'm not. There are other things you can then bring in, but diet on its own, essential, absolutely the foundation, but on its own, it's only going to go so far. And of course, how far it will go will definitely vary with individuals. Some people will become much more sensitive and access much more. But unless you then begin engaging some of these other approaches, really, these relatively profound experiences, it's easy for us to look back and go, oh, I remember when, I felt anxious. I never thought out of the box. And we kind of measure how far we've come and presume it's some giant leap. Well, it might just be the first step on a very long ladder. How much further can we take this?
Okay, and what are the insights that you've come to? What kind of things can you report back from your travels?
Well, I'd say my experiences simply support the ancient traditions, whether they're in oral or written form, and of course the experiences people still have today. I think that what we currently experience as normal is incredibly limited, incredibly suppressed, and the product of a damaged system. And I certainly include myself in that. And these ancient sort of communications, along with their modern counterparts, if you take the best of all of the experiences and put them together, so these experiences that almost defy description, they're so amazing. I mean, for example, how much pleasure is it possible to feel without exploding? We measure our data, how you feel it. Oh, I feel okay. Now, most of us, if we're honest, have at times felt phenomenally good, whether it's the judicious use of drugs or through sexual experience or whatever. We have a capacity to feel phenomenally better than we normally do, most of us. And yet we're quite content to muddle through life and go, yeah, I feel okay. And maybe some days you feel a little bit worse and call that depression. Yet we know we have the neural equipment to feel off the scale amazing. Not at anybody's expense. We even have a culture now where somehow extreme pleasure is somehow seen as a bad thing, or maybe it's exploitative. I'm talking about what our innate capacity for feeling good is. And all the evidence around us, the written reports, the reports that people come up with, we have the capacity to feel absolutely divine and amazing in such a state that the idea we could harm anybody is absurd. We know that capacity exists, yet we settle for, what do we settle for? Kind of feeling okay. And that's supposed to be like a sign of mental health. Now, why aren't we putting as much effort as we can into feeling as good as we can? Not by buying loads of shit we don't need, which is based on left brain anticipation. Get excited about buying something and then you've got it, then you don't want it anymore. I'm talking about the innate capacity to feel amazing. Now, that's a threat to the left brain, because if people start feeling really good, they're not going to be driven by these absurd ideas that they can feel good by buying crap. It's like, using MDMA as an example, ecstasy as an example. And I'm not, and I never do say it's a solution or it's what's gone missing, but it's a really good analog to look at. there've been PhD papers written on this from, I think, football fans and possibly from the sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, where there were people who'd grown up with certain beliefs and concepts remember our left brain, and it identifies with them. It thinks that's what it is. Okay, so our cultural beliefs, we often identify so closely with them that we'll defend them, even to the point of death. Okay, so classic example, it could be Millwall and Chelsea fans. You know, the kind of troubles that used to go on a long time ago, or the loyalists and the Catholic Protestant divide in Northern Ireland, where people would get together to hurt each other, even to kill each other. Yeah, and yet when this stuff came out, when this stuff came around, I mean, it'd been around for a long time, but when it came on to the dance scene and it was pretty clean, it was before criminal gangs got involved and started cutting it with all sorts of stuff. People who at one time would have been meeting to kill each other, having these experiences, next thing they're on the dance floor hugging each other, lifelong friends. Now, if that's not a profound example of what we need to be looking at. Now, again, to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying we should all necessarily think that is a whole solution. But if that's not a phenomenally important clue as to what can happen if you change the neurochemistry and structure and how that results in our behavioral change, then I think it's too late. Then we're stuffed. If we don't really get a grip of this and say, look, something amazing goes on with these approaches, whether it's traditional plant medicines, not saying the solutions, but they're telling us something about how neurochemical structure and the neurochemical regime effectively dictates our behavior. Okay. Now, if we look at all the commonalities, we know an awful lot about how to shift it from fear, control, willingness to harm each other. We know how to shift it in a different direction. We know that already. And the chemistry that went missing from the forests parallels these chemical analog, these modern analogs. It's very similar. It's not necessarily as strong, but remember, there was thousands of these things. It was a big blanket. We know that stuff went missing. And we know these ancient traditions talk about us having this profound sense of connection. So really, is our current regime, why would we defend a regime that's so incredibly dysfunctional, particularly when we have evidence that we must be chronically neurochemically deficient from all these classes of compounds that have gone missing? We also know certain classes of compounds that can help us, at least temporarily. Why aren't we putting all this stuff together and saying, like, how good can we feel? How intelligent can we feel? Why aren't we focusing on these things? Well, the only reason I can see it's kind of circular is because we're already demented and we're actually barking completely up the wrong tree. We're more interested in building stealth bombers and building nuclear power stations and continuing down this blind alley of self-destruction. Well, that's exactly what you get if you had severe dementia.
The interesting thing with these drugs, though, is that they do seem to borrow chemicals like serotonin. I don't know how it works, but I imagine serotonin from the future. So you have a crash after taking them because they've used up all the chemicals that should have lasted you a longer time. And I think that seems indicative that what people feel under the influence of drugs is a falsehood and not real. What would you say to people who suggest that?
I think there's a couple of things to look at. I think certainly our current neurochemical regime and what it produces is the scariest thing by miles. I'd rather, just taking that at its most simplistic level, I'd rather live in a world where people were having ecstasy-like experiences and crashing, then having ecstasy experiences and crashing, than the world we live in. Not that I'm saying that is a solution, of course, but what's the downside of that? What's the worst thing? When you look at what we're doing now in our unmodified state, well, actually, is it an unmodified state? I'm saying it's not. I'm saying this is the badly altered state. This is the currently seriously dysfunctional state. Look at what we're doing. That's way more scary than what comes out of slightly ignorant use of neurochemicals. For sure, there's a lot of things that need to be looked at there, but looking at what we're doing, what's considered normal, that's way more scary than anything that comes out of MDMA use. However, and back to your point, no, I don't think that is the case at all. Of course, if you take a chemical that is by nature transient and you get temporary access and it wears off, yes, that's one way of describing it. But which way around should it be? Is the temporary sanity transient and we come back to the insanity? And why would we defend that? Why would we want to stay in this insane state? Is it possible to make these states sustainable? Have we addressed that? Well, mostly we don't even want people experimenting with these states, let alone, okay, how can you possibly make these wonderful feelings as safe as possible and as sustainable as possible. And bearing in mind that's what the whole mystic tradition was about. They weren't trying to amplify a current state. They were trying to get into a wholly other state and make it as sustainable as possible.
Okay, so the reason, for instance, that we'll have a crash after taking these substances is because they're analogues. They're not the thing that used to happen in our original brain. But if that's the best we can do, it might be good to study these in a controlled environment with legal permission.
Agreed, and I understand that. But again, if you look at the wider picture, well, these chemicals will not fix the damage to the left hemisphere, nor will they take it out of the way other than temporarily. So yes, you get these temporary windows. I think we should be looking at what happens in the windows, not what happens when we crash again. It's a bit like saying, well, look, we've got this phenomenal spaceship, but it's crashed. We've now figured out how to get it off the ground a bit. We haven't quite figured out how to keep it flying, but should we give up, or should we say no? It's safer to stay on the ground where all these problems are. So yes, that inevitably that is the challenge: how to make these things sustainable. But it doesn't mean that because they're not yet sustainable, because we haven't even begun to address how to do that in the modern way of looking at things. It doesn't mean we should be going, oh well, we just accept the really insane state that we know where that's going. We already know where our current state is going. We can see historically where it goes, and we know where we're heading. And it looks incredibly grim. Surely it makes a lot more sense to look at these clues. And remember, I'm not saying they're solutions in themselves, but they're telling us a lot about what could be done if we can find a way to sustainably engage this latent function. The challenge is the left hemisphere is effectively a sentient being. It's a very limited being. It's very frightened. It's got very few traits, but it's a sentient being. It's not going to, you can convince it to do all sorts of things. And it seems like it's a good idea until the experiential shift comes. Then sometimes it gets frightened.
This is the most fascinating subject because it seems to me like the only game in town, given that it underpins everything humanity does. What's been the reaction of the science world to your findings?
Well, bearing in mind, to be perfectly honest, all I think I'm trying to do at best is translate a very ancient idea into modern dumbed-down language. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't think I've come up with anything new here. I'm just trying to reformulate it in a way we can understand. And to be honest, I've been amazed. I had my own demons to deal with, and I still do. I had my own skeptical, rational mind trying to figure out if this could possibly make any sense. And a lot of the insights that I had were coming out of experimentation with all these shamanic approaches and so on. So it was like, well, maybe this is just some deluded bunch of nonsense. Yet at the same time, it seems to make sense. It correlates with the modern data. It correlates with these ancient approaches. So when I put it all together and put it into this simple idea, left side's damaged, it's in charge. Right side's much less damaged, it's latent, and we're inhibited by this missing biochemistry. You sell that as an idea. Of course, it's easy to start checking the basically the objective data from all these disciplines. And when you start doing that, all the bits seem to fit. So the reaction I've had, bearing in mind part of my agenda has been to put this in academic, or at least a language that would be close enough to academic language that people could look at it. And my invitation is, yeah, sure, challenge it. If there's some holes in it, make it go away, but at least take it on board first. Don't dismiss it because it's unfamiliar. At least in the tradition of debating, take on the question, have a look at the information, and at least bear in mind the possibility that you're trying to address this question with a piece of equipment that isn't working as well as you think. And once you do that, then the reaction's been phenomenal. I've sent the book, or I've sent various summaries to a range of people because I thought, well, I've got to check in here. I could be completely lost in this, and it won't take long. Bearing in mind, I'm talking about a serious neural condition that's led to severe perceptual problems species-wide. Now, that's a massive claim to make, and I can't possibly get away with that unless there's a mountain of evidence in all these areas. We just never looked for it. So the response I'm getting here, it's exceptionally exciting. It's, people from neurological backgrounds, anthropological backgrounds, spiritually inclined philosophers, ex-police chiefs, right across the board. The reaction from a lot of these people is, oh my God, this makes sense. It's shockingly how good sense of it. Right across to lay readers who've never really studied this. An awful lot of people already know there's something seriously wrong.
Well, considering your book looks at complex neurochemistry, it is incredibly accessible. And I totally understand it. And I found it a jubilant experience to read, and also the kind of thing that I will bloody lend to anyone who'll take a look, because it's such a great thing that the information is out there and also being taken seriously now.
Well, it's been small scale so far because I self-published initially. I wanted to test the water, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, completely off on the wrong tangent here. Because obviously, if I, this is partly self-diagnosis. So if I'm saying, okay, it looks to me like I've got a severely incompetent left brain and it's subject to delusion, confabulation, all these kind of things, then this is real tricky stuff, because how can you make sense of anything? But of course, like I say, there should be objective data, and there should be some potential, at least if you apply the right approaches there, if you're damn lucky, as some people are, to get a little bit more objectivity from that other sense of self we have. So putting those things together, now it makes sense to my rational mind. I can see the map. It's not a solution. This is just a diagnosis. It's just a map in rational language, but it makes sense to my rational brain now. Will it make sense to anybody else's? And like I say, the reaction, small scale so far, probably a few tens of thousands of people have read it so far, has been exceptionally exciting. And my whole point of this has never been about, can I come up with a cool theory to explain why we're insane and we've had it? That's not the point at all. I'm excited at the prospect, however challenging initially it may be, that when we look in the mirror, can we hold our hands up? Yeah, this is where the problem is. This is where the low-level paranoia is that I don't want to speak about, classic symptom of mental ill health. This is where all the decisions come from. This isn't about the bankers. This isn't about the politicians. This is about a species-wide condition. And yes, some people have it worse than others, and they're more frightened and they want to take charge. But we're all in this condition together. We've all got it. And that's a human-scale problem. If the problem's between our ears, then it's a scale that we can start to fix. And like I say, we already know. We've already been handed a huge amount of information on how to at least treat it. And with the very best of our technological advances in the midst of the chaos we've caused with that, put all that in the same place. And I'm not worried about practically solving this problem. The biggest challenge, I think, is coming up with a clear diagnosis and how to communicate it in a way we're willing to act on it. Because by definition, again, if we all got a kind of form of dementia, it's not enough to go, oh, by the way, you've got dementia, here's some pills, take this. Because it probably won't make any sense, and you'd probably end up probably eating the bottle and throwing the pills away. And, it's a crude metaphor. So what's the language of dementia? How to put all these ancient ideas in a format that even my stupid left brain can understand? Well, as a male, it's got to be engineering language. And bearing in mind we live in patriarchal systems, which, to be honest, I think the patriarchal and hierarchical systems that we've come to be familiar with in the last 5 or 10,000 years, they're a symptom of this condition, because actually males get hit harder than females. I talked about hormones, and obviously there's a lot more information in the book and on the websites and stuff. But testosterone's a key player in this. And it turns out that while both genders have this condition, males get hit hardest and exhibit a wider range of symptoms, including a greater percentage at the wrong end of the spectrum, totally devoid of any compassion, totally devoid of any empathy. So you can imagine why male-dominated society, rather than it being some kind of cultural shift that's a good thing or whatever, it's a symptom of an underlying condition where a percentage of men, not all men, but a percentage of men are more frightened than average. They need to be in control more than average. And where do they end up? Running everything. It's not their fault, by the way. This isn't about apportioning blame. This is a neurological condition. This is about as pointless as getting angry when you go to a classic Victorian insane asylum and you look at people harming themselves or each other. It isn't anybody's fault. But do we want the least functional members of society, who through no fault of their own have aspired to take control, do we want them flying the planes, deciding whether we go to war or not, deciding whether to build new? Surely, in the meantime, until we can figure all this out, we don't want the least functional people in charge. We want the most functional people, and we even want to look at the control mechanisms and structures we have. How can we get through this while we figure out how to fix it without causing, you'd have to lock 100 of the sharpest people together in a room for 100 years to come up with a more inhumane system than we've created. It's absurdly inhumane, and it doesn't happen by itself. We create this system. It takes a huge amount of energy to maintain this insidious and insane system we have. And at the very top of it are typically not universally, but typically older males utterly disconnected from reality because they have this condition more than average. And I know I have this condition. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be stuck in my rational mind, frightened, insecure, and unable to perceive the greater picture. I've been lucky. I've had tiny glimpses of something beyond that, enough to excite me and go, oh my God, there's something else here. Exactly as these ancient traditions said. So nothing new. How on earth to figure a way out of this when we're actually stuck in, it's like, I mentioned this in the book. I think the Matrix movies, classic analogy, obviously coming from some of the Eastern influences and Buddhist tradition. We're stuck using the piece of equipment that's badly damaged, trying to figure it out. Is it impossible? No. Is it tricky? For sure. The first thing is a clear diagnosis. If we can work on a diagnosis that even our left brain can understand, that's not a solution, but that's an absolutely essential first step.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for talking to us. If people want to find out more, they can go to leftinthedark.org.uk and beyond-belief.org.uk. Lots of luck with your research, and please keep us informed of what's happening, because I think a lot of us are extremely interested.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks.